Denzel Washington walked through the bustling streets of New York City, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat as the cool evening breeze rustled through his thoughts. Life had been a whirlwind lately, interviews, premieres, and the constant pressure to deliver. Tonight, he sought the kind of peace only the city's anonymity could offer, hoping to find clarity amidst its chaos. As he turned a corner near a crowded subway station, his eyes fell on a man sitting against a brick wall. The man was disheveled, his hair matted under a worn-out cap, but it was a sign that caught Denzel's attention. Veteran. Lost everything. Not my hope. For a moment, Denzel froze. In the man's tired eyes, he saw a flicker of resilience, a quiet strength that defied his worn exterior. The world moved around them, people rushing past, avoiding the man's gaze, as though he were invisible. Denzel felt a pang of guilt. How many times had he done the same in the past? He approached cautiously, unsure if the man would welcome the intrusion. "Hey," Denzel said gently, his voice low enough to be inviting but firm enough to be heard over the city noise. "You hungry? Can I get you a coffee or something?" The man looked up, surprised. His face was weathered, his expression guarded, as though he didn't trust the kindness of strangers anymore. But something in Denzel's voice, or maybe the way he crouched to meet his gaze, softened him. He gave a small nod. "Coffee sounds good," he said, his voice gravelly, the words coming out slowly, as if he hadn't spoken much in a while. "Great. Let's find a spot," Denzel replied with a smile, gesturing toward a nearby cafe. The man hesitated, glancing at his belongings, a tattered backpack and a thin blanket. "Don't worry, they'll be safe," Denzel assured him, his tone warm and reassuring. They walked to the cafe together, an odd pair, Denzel, with his polished demeanor and quiet charisma, and the man, whose hunched shoulders carried the weight of years on the street. Inside, the warmth of the cafe enveloped them as the man sat down gingerly at a corner table. Denzel ordered 2 coffees and a couple of sandwiches, returning with a tray. As they sat across from each other, the man finally introduced himself. "John," he said simply, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup as though it was the first warmth he'd felt in days. "Nice to meet you, John. I'm Denzel," he replied, keeping his tone casual, not wanting to overwhelm him. John raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I know who you are," he said, a flicker of humor breaking through his otherwise solemn demeanor. "Didn't think I'd be having coffee with a movie star today." Denzel chuckled softly, brushing off the title. "I'm just a guy who wanted to sit and chat," he said. "What's your story, John?" John's expression shifted. He looked down at his coffee, as if trying to decide how much of himself to reveal. After a long pause, he began to speak, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of his words. He told Denzel about his years in the military, the friends he'd lost in combat, and the battles he still fought in his own mind every day. Denzel listened intently, not interrupting, nodding when John paused to collect himself. The conversation stretched on, and for the first time in a long while, John felt heard. As they spoke, Denzel's initial sense of curiosity deepened into something more profound, a recognition of John's quiet strength and the harsh realities so many like him faced. He realized this wasn't just a fleeting encounter, it was the beginning of something much bigger. Denzel leaned forward, his elbows resting on the small cafe table as he listened intently. Across from him, John sat with his coffee cradled in his hands, staring into the dark liquid as if searching for the courage to share the depths of his story. The hum of conversations and the hiss of the espresso machine filled the background, but in this corner of the cafe, time seemed to slow down. "It's not a story people want to hear," John began, his voice low but steady. "Most just see a guy like me and figure I did it to myself. Drugs, bad choices, laziness. They don't ask, and I stopped telling." "Well," Denzel said gently, "I'm asking. Take your time." John glanced up, his eyes meeting Denzel's. For a moment, he hesitated, as if testing the sincerity in the man's gaze. Something in Denzel's expression, open, patient, free of judgment, encouraged him to continue. "I served in the Army for 15 years, John said, his voice carrying both pride and sorrow. "Sign up right out of high school. It was the only thing that made sense back then. I didn't have much going for me. No family to speak of, no money for college. But the Army? It gave me a purpose, discipline, a brotherhood. Denzel nodded, sensing the weight of the memories John was about to share. I did 3 tours overseas, Afghanistan, Iraq. You see things over there. John's voice trailed off as he stared into the distance, his eyes clouded with memories. Things no one should ever have to see. Friends dying in your arms, civilians caught in the crossfire. And you keep going. Because you have to. He paused, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup. But when you come back home, it's different. People don't know what to say to you. They thank you for your service, sure, but they don't see what's in your head. The nightmares, the guilt. You're supposed to just fit back in like nothing happened. John's voice cracked slightly as he continued. I tried, got a job in construction, even met someone. Her name was Sarah. She was the best thing that ever happened to me. We got married. For a while, it felt like I had a shot at being normal. Denzel's heart ached as he watched John's expression shift from nostalgic to pained. He knew the story was about to take a darker turn. But the nightmares didn't stop, John admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I'd wake up screaming, sweating, sometimes lashing out before I even knew where I was. Sarah tried to help. God, she tried. But I wasn't the same man she married. I started drinking to quiet the noise in my head. That only made things worse. She left after 2 years. Said she couldn't do it anymore. John rubbed a hand across his face, as if trying to wipe away the shame. I don't blame her. I wasn't easy to live with. And after she left, it all went downhill. I lost my job, got into some trouble, ended up on the street. For a moment, he fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Denzel let the pause linger, sensing that John needed the space to process his emotions. What about the VA? Denzel asked softly, not wanting to push but curious about the support John may, or may not, have received. John let out a bitter laugh. The VA? They're overwhelmed, underfunded. I tried getting help, but the waiting lists are months long. And when you're sleeping under a bridge, waiting doesn't cut it. So, here I am. Denzel's chest tightened as he absorbed John's story. He could see the toll it had taken on the man before him. The tired eyes, the slumped shoulders, the faint tremor in his hands. But he could also see the strength it took for John to share his truth, to keep going despite everything. Do you ever think about what you'd do if things turned around? Denzel asked after a moment, his voice thoughtful. John blinked, as if the question caught him off guard. Turn around? I don't know. I haven't thought about that in a long time. Maybe I try to help other guys like me. Guys who got left behind. The sincerity in John's voice struck Denzel deeply. Here was a man who had every reason to give up, yet he still held on to a glimmer of hope. Not just for himself, but for others. John, Denzel said quietly, leaning closer, your story needs to be heard. And I think it's time someone helped you write the next chapter. For the first time, John's lips curved into a faint smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to signal the smallest spark of hope, a spark that Denzel vowed to nurture. After hearing John's story, Denzel felt a heaviness settle in his chest. He couldn't shake the image of this man, so full of quiet strength, yet beaten down by life, going back to the cold streets after their conversation. It didn't sit right with him. Something about John's resilience called out to Denzel, urging him to act. John, Denzel said softly, his voice steady but laced with determination. Let me help you. Tonight, at least, you shouldn't have to sleep out there. John looked up from his now empty coffee cup, his eyes wary. I appreciate the offer, man, but I've been doing this a long time. I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, Denzel said firmly. Not to me. And I'm not talking about charity. Everyone deserves a little help sometimes. Let me make a call. John hesitated, his pride battling with the reality of his situation. Finally, he gave a small nod, his voice barely above a whisper. All right, I'll take it, just for tonight. Denzel reached for his phone and stepped outside the cafe. The cool night air bit at his skin, but his mind was focused. He dialed a trusted friend, someone he knew worked with an organization dedicated to helping homeless veterans. After a brief conversation, Arrangements were made for John to have a place to sleep that night. A clean, warm bed in a temporary housing facility not far from the cafe. When Denzel returned, John was sitting quietly, his hands folded on the table. There was a mixture of gratitude and apprehension in his eyes, as though he was still trying to make sense of the stranger sitting across from him. "All right," Denzel said, sliding into the seat. "They're expecting you. Let's get you over there." John nodded, his voice gruff as he said, "Thanks, Denzel." "Really?" The two walked back to where John had left his few belongings. He stuffed his blanket and backpack into a torn duffel bag, slinging it over his shoulder. As they headed toward the facility, the city's lights flickered around them, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. They reached the housing center, a modest building tucked between larger complexes. The staff greeted them warmly, their expressions softening when Denzel explained who John was and what he'd been through. A young woman led John to his room, leaving Denzel waiting in the lobby. It wasn't long before John returned, his face carrying a mix of emotions Denzel couldn't quite place. "It's nice," John said awkwardly, as if unused to expressing gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Denzel replied, his voice gentle. "Just rest tonight. Get some good sleep. You deserve that much." John hesitated, then extended his hand. Denzel clasped it firmly, their handshake lingering a moment longer than usual. It wasn't just a gesture of thanks. It was an unspoken promise between them, a connection forged in that brief but powerful encounter. As Denzel walked away, he couldn't help but glance back. John stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the light inside, watching him leave. Denzel felt a surge of emotion rise within him. He'd helped someone tonight, but it didn't feel like enough. The thought of walking away and resuming his life as though nothing had happened didn't sit right. John's story wasn't unique. There were thousands, maybe millions, of veterans like him who had slipped through the cracks. This wasn't just about one man. It was about all of them. Later that night, as Denzel sat in his quiet apartment, his mind was far from the comfort of his surroundings. He thought about John's worn face, his steady voice, and the resilience that still burned within him despite everything. Denzel knew this wasn't the end of the story. It couldn't be. It was just the beginning. With his mind racing and his heart full, he pulled out a notepad and began jotting down ideas. He wasn't sure where this would lead, but he knew one thing. He had the means to make a difference, and he was going to do it. For John, and for every other veteran who had been forgotten. Denzel sat at his kitchen table the next morning, his coffee untouched. The events of the previous evening replayed in his mind. John's story, his resilience, and his quiet gratitude had left an indelible mark. Denzel couldn't shake the image of John packing up his few belongings, or the way his voice trembled with both hope and hesitation as he accepted the help. This wasn't just about John. It was about every man and woman like him, forgotten by a system they had once sworn to protect. Denzel had always believed in using his platform for good, but this felt different. It wasn't about a broad charity or a generic cause. This was personal. He grabbed his phone and started scrolling through his contacts, looking for someone he knew would understand. His friend Marcus, a philanthropist who had worked extensively with veterans, seemed like the right person to call. "Marcus," Denzel said when his friend answered, "I need your help. I met someone last night, a veteran named John. His story shook me. We need to do something, not just for him, but for all of them." Marcus listened patiently as Denzel recounted his encounter with John. When Denzel finished, Marcus spoke, his tone serious. "Denzel, you're right. This is a crisis, but it's bigger than either of us. If we're going to make an impact, we need to bring in more people. Advocates, organizations, donors. You've got the voice and the reach to make this happen." The conversation left Denzel energized. He began assembling a team of people he trusted, friends, colleagues, and leaders in the nonprofit sector who shared his passion for change. Within days, he had organized a private meeting at his home. The group included philanthropists, veterans advocates, and a few influential public figures who had expressed interest in tackling systemic issues. At the meeting, Denzel shared John's story. He spoke candidly about the pain and strength he had seen in the man's eyes, and how that one encounter had opened his eyes to a larger issue. "This isn't just about helping one man," Denzel said, his voice steady and passionate. "It's about changing the way we treat the people who've given everything for this country. They deserve better. We can't keep turning a blind eye." The room fell silent for a moment before Marcus spoke up. "We need a plan, something tangible. Housing, counseling, job training. These are the things they need most. If we pool our resources and use our platforms, we can make it happen." The brainstorming session that followed was electric. Ideas flew across the room, from funding transitional housing programs to creating a public awareness campaign about the challenges veterans face. Denzel listened, his notebook filling with ideas as the group worked together to shape the vision. One suggestion resonated deeply with him: storytelling. It was something he knew well. By sharing the personal stories of veterans like John, they could put a human face on the issue, moving people to act. Denzel offered to spearhead a documentary series that would highlight these stories, bringing attention to the problem in a way statistics alone never could. Within a week, the team had a clear plan of action. They would launch a multifaceted initiative aimed at addressing both the immediate and long-term needs of homeless veterans. The first step was a fundraiser, one that would bring together donors, influencers, and veterans themselves to raise both money and awareness. Denzel also worked behind the scenes to secure media coverage. His connections in Hollywood proved invaluable. Talk shows, news outlets, and social media platforms were soon abuzz with news of the campaign. The public response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out, offering donations, volunteering their time, and sharing their own stories of veterans they knew. Amid all the activity, Denzel made sure not to lose sight of the man who had inspired it all. He visited John regularly, checking in on his progress and ensuring he felt supported. Each time they met, John seemed a little stronger, a little more confident. He even began talking about wanting to help other veterans once he got back on his feet. "Funny how things come full circle," John said during one of their conversations. "A month ago, I didn't think anyone saw me. Now I'm sitting here talking about helping others. Feels good, man." Denzel smiled. "It's just the beginning, John. You've got a story that can move mountains. Let's make sure it gets heard." As the initiative gained momentum, Denzel felt a growing sense of purpose. It wasn't just about the fame or the platform anymore. It was about doing something real, something lasting. John had given him a new perspective, and Denzel was determined to honor that by building a movement that would change lives. By the end of the month, the first transitional housing center funded by the campaign opened its doors. John was one of its first residents, a symbol of the hope and possibility that drove the project. Standing in the lobby of the center on opening day, Denzel looked around at the people who had come together to make it happen. He felt a quiet pride, knowing this was only the beginning of the work to come. As weeks turned into months, John began a journey that felt almost impossible just a short time ago, a journey of rebuilding himself. At first, it was small, tentative steps. The staff at the Transitional Housing Center provided him with a routine: meals at regular times, group meetings for veterans, and therapy sessions to help him confront the weight of his past. It was overwhelming at first, but Denzel had made a promise to be there for him, and he kept it. John's transformation didn't come easily. The scars of his past ran deep, and his nightmares didn't disappear overnight. Therapy sessions unearthed emotions he had buried for years. There were days when he would sit on the edge of his bed, staring out the window, doubting whether he could truly leave his old life behind. On one particularly hard day, he called Denzel, his voice trembling. "I don't think I can do this," John confessed. "I keep messing up, and it feels like I'm just waiting to fall back to where I was." Denzel's response was immediate. "John, no one said it would be easy, but you're not alone. You've made it this far, and I know you've got it in you to keep going. Don't give up now." Those words stayed with John, and little by little, he pushed forward. His therapy sessions became a lifeline, helping him not only confront his trauma, but also understand that his struggles didn't define him. The group meetings with other veterans were equally important. For the first time, he didn't feel isolated. He met men and women who had walked similar paths, who understood the unspoken pain he carried. Their shared stories created a bond that reminded him he wasn't alone. One of the most significant turning points came when John took up a part-time job at a local warehouse. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it gave him a sense of purpose. The first paycheck he received was a moment of quiet triumph. He held the envelope in his hands, staring at his name printed on it, proof that he was beginning to reclaim his independence. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Denzel said when they met for coffee one evening, noticing the subtle pride in John's posture. John nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I forgot what it felt like to earn something, to feel useful, but it wasn't just about the work." As John grew more confident, he started giving back in small ways. He volunteered at the Transitional Housing Center, helping new arrivals settle in. He shared his story at group meetings, offering encouragement to those who were just starting their own journeys. His words carried weight because they came from someone who had lived through it. Slowly, he began to see himself not as a victim of his circumstances, but as someone who could help others rise above theirs. Denzel continued to check in regularly, their friendship growing stronger with each visit. They often spoke about life, about the challenges John had faced, and the dreams he once had but thought he'd lost forever. One day, during a quiet conversation, Denzel asked, "If you could do anything, what would it be?" John leaned back in his chair, thinking. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "I used to think about running my own business one day. Something small, maybe a repair shop. I was good with my hands before. Well, before everything, why not now?" Denzel asked, his tone encouraging. "You've got the skills, and you've got a story people need to hear. You'd inspire more people than you think." John laughed softly, shaking his head. "I don't know about that, but maybe one day." As Denzel's initiative gained traction, John found himself at the center of a growing movement. He attended events and fundraisers, often at Denzel's insistence, sharing his story with audiences that included both everyday supporters and high-profile donors. At first, it was daunting to stand in front of so many people, but he soon realized the power of his voice. His authenticity and humility resonated with people, and his story became a symbol of hope and perseverance. Despite his growing confidence, John remained grounded. He still woke up early to go to work, still attended therapy sessions, and still made time to help others at the center. But now, there was a lightness to his step, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. The man who once sat on a curb with nothing but a sign now stood as a testament to what could happen when someone was given a chance, and when they had the courage to take it. One evening, after a particularly emotional fundraiser, Denzel pulled John aside. "You're doing incredible things, John. I hope you see that." John looked down for a moment, his voice steady as he replied, "I'm just trying to pay it forward. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. If I can do that for someone else, maybe it's worth something." Denzel smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride. It's worth everything. As John walked home that night, he thought about how far he had come. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had control over his life. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. And that, he realized, was the greatest transformation of all. As Denzel's initiative began to take shape, the ripple effects were undeniable. What started as a deeply personal mission to help John had grown into something far larger. The initial fundraiser had been a success, drawing attention from celebrities, business leaders, and everyday citizens moved by the stories Denzel shared. But Denzel knew that to create lasting change, he needed to go beyond charity. He needed to build a movement that would challenge society's indifference toward homeless veterans. With a core team of advocates and volunteers, Denzel launched a nationwide campaign, aptly named Heroes Unforgotten. The campaign focused on 3 pillars: transitional housing, mental health support, and career training for veterans. These weren't just lofty ideas. They were actionable goals backed by resources and partnerships Denzel had carefully cultivated. One of the first major milestones came with the release of a documentary series spearheaded by Denzel himself. Each episode followed a different veteran's story, shedding light on the systemic challenges they faced and the resilience they showed in overcoming them. John was the centerpiece of the first episode, sharing his journey with unflinching honesty. The episode aired on a major streaming platform, and within days, it went viral. Messages poured in from viewers who had been deeply moved by the documentary. Some were veterans themselves, expressing gratitude for finally feeling seen. Others were families who shared how the stories had opened their eyes to the struggles faced by their loved ones. Donations surged, far exceeding the team's expectations. Denzel knew this wasn't just a testament to the veterans' courage. It was a sign that people were ready to make a difference if given the chance. Amid the media frenzy, John found himself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. Invitations came from news outlets and events asking him to speak about his experiences. At first, he hesitated, unsure if he was ready for such visibility. But Denzel encouraged him, reminding him of the power of his story. "People need to hear from you, John," Denzel said one evening as they prepared for a live interview. "You're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for everyone who feels forgotten." John nodded, still nervous but resolute. When the cameras rolled, his authenticity shone through. He spoke with quiet conviction about his time in the military, the challenges he faced upon returning, and the hope that had been reignited through Denzel's support. Viewers were captivated, not just by his story, but by the humility and strength he exuded. Overnight, John became a symbol of the very resilience the campaign sought to celebrate. As Heroes Unforgotten gained traction, more organizations and public figures joined the cause. Several large companies pledged to hire veterans as part of their corporate responsibility initiatives. A major hotel chain committed to providing temporary housing for homeless veterans in cities across the country. Even lawmakers began taking notice, with several proposing bills to increase funding for veteran services. At the same time, grassroots efforts flourished. Community groups organized clothing drives, job fairs, and therapy workshops tailored specifically for veterans. Social media played a crucial role, with supporters sharing stories, fundraising events, and success updates using the campaign's hashtag. The movement wasn't just about raising money. It was about changing the way society viewed and treated its veterans. John, now a confident and active participant in the campaign, found himself mentoring others. At the Transitional Housing Center, he often spent evenings talking with new arrivals, offering words of encouragement and sharing practical advice. He also began working closely with the campaign team, contributing his firsthand insights to shape programs that would have the greatest impact. "I used to think my story ended when I hit the streets," John told a group at one event. "But it didn't. It was just a chapter. And now, I get to help write the next chapter for others." Denzel watched John with pride, marveling at how far he had come. The man who once hesitated to accept help was now inspiring others to believe in their own potential. It was a powerful reminder of why this work mattered. As the campaign's success grew, Denzel remained grounded. He knew there was still much to be done. One evening, after a particularly long day of planning, he sat down with Marcus, the philanthropist who had helped him at the beginning of the journey. "Do you think we're making enough of a difference?" Denzel asked, his tone reflective. Marcus smiled. "Look around, Denzel. You've created something real here. It's not just about the money raised or the programs launched. It's about changing lives, and you're doing that." Denzel nodded, taking a deep breath. "I just want to make sure we keep the momentum going. This can't be a trend. It has to last." And last it did. The first few housing centers funded by the campaign opened their doors, providing not just shelter, but a path to stability for hundreds of veterans. Job training programs saw graduates securing employment in industries ranging from tech to manufacturing. More importantly, the conversation around veterans' issues had shifted. They were no longer seen as invisible, their struggles ignored. They were seen as heroes who deserved respect, dignity, and a chance to rebuild their lives. The movement had taken on a life of its own, but Denzel never forgot where it started. Whenever he could, he made time to visit the housing centers and sit with the veterans who lived there, listening to their stories and reminding them that they were never alone. For John, the journey continued as well. He was no longer the man who sat on the curb with a tattered sign. He was a leader, an advocate, and a beacon of hope for others. And as he often reminded Denzel, it all began with one small act of kindness. Months of tireless work led to the grand culmination of Heroes Unforgotten, a national fundraiser and awareness event, held in the heart of New York City. The venue was a sprawling auditorium, its stage framed by banners bearing the campaign's motto, "No hero left behind." The atmosphere buzzed with energy as attendees, celebrities, philanthropists, veterans, and supporters from all walks of life, filled the seats. It wasn't just a fundraiser. It was a celebration of resilience, a night to honor those who had given everything and remind the world of their worth. Denzel stood backstage, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, yet visibly nervous. This event was deeply personal to him, not just because of the cause, but because of what he was about to ask of John. For weeks, Denzel had been preparing John for this moment, to deliver the keynote speech. John had resisted at first, doubting his ability to speak to such a large audience. "I'm just a guy who lost his way," he'd said. But Denzel saw more in him. He saw a leader, a voice that could inspire others in ways no one else could. Now the time had come. Denzel approached John, who sat quietly in a chair, his hands clasped tightly. He was wearing a suit Denzel had helped him pick out, though he still tugged at the tie, as if it were strangling him. His eyes betrayed a mix of fear and determination. "You ready?" Denzel asked, his voice low and steady. John exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "No, but I guess that doesn't matter, does it?" Denzel placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to be perfect. Just be yourself. Speak from the heart. That's all anyone wants to hear." John nodded, his jaw tightening as he stood. He followed Denzel to the side of the stage, peeking out at the massive crowd. The spotlight illuminated rows upon rows of faces, all turned toward the stage, waiting. His stomach churned, but he reminded himself why he was there. This wasn't just about him. It was about every veteran who felt forgotten, every person still struggling in the shadows. The MC's voice boomed over the speakers, announcing John as a keynote speaker. The applause was thunderous as John stepped onto the stage, the sound almost disorienting. He approached the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped its edges. For a moment, he stood in silence, his heart pounding in his chest. "Good evening," he began, his voice hesitant but clear. "My name is John. I'm a veteran, and for a long time, I thought that was all I'd ever be. Just a veteran. Someone who fought for his country, came home, and lost everything." The room grew still, the weight of his words settling over the audience. John paused, glancing at Denzel, who stood in the wings, giving him an encouraging nod. "I spent years on the streets," John continued. "Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how to ask for help. And honestly, I didn't think anyone cared. People walked by me every day like I didn't exist. And maybe I started to believe that I wasn't worth saving." His voice wavered, but he pushed forward. Then one day, someone stopped. Someone looked at me, not as a failure, not as a problem to avoid, but as a human being. That someone was Denzel Washington. The audience erupted into applause, but John held up his hand to quiet them. "I'm not telling you this to praise him. I'm telling you this because what he did for me wasn't about fame or charity. It was about seeing a person who had been invisible for too long and deciding to do something about it." He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice growing stronger. "There are thousands of people out there just like me. Veterans who gave everything for their country and came back to nothing. They don't need handouts. They need someone to believe in them, someone to give them a chance to stand again." John's words carried an emotional weight that left the room silent, save for the occasional sniffle from the audience. He recounted his journey, from the moment he met Denzel to the progress he had made since. He spoke of the housing center that had become his sanctuary, the therapy sessions that had helped him find his voice, and the job that had given him back his dignity. "But this isn't just my story," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "It's the story of every veteran who's been forgotten. And tonight, I'm asking you to do what Denzel did for me. See them, hear them, help them." As he finished, the room erupted into a standing ovation. The applause was deafening, a wave of emotion that washed over John as he stepped back from the podium. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked out at the crowd, humbled by the response. Denzel met him as he exited the stage, pulling him into a firm embrace. "You nailed it," Denzel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were incredible." John smiled faintly, his voice trembling. "I just spoke the truth." The rest of the evening was a celebration of the campaign's success. Donations flooded in, far surpassing expectations. But more than the money, the event sparked conversations across the country. John's speech became the centerpiece of news stories and social media posts, galvanizing people to take action. For John, it was a moment of transformation, not just for himself, but for everyone he represented. And for Denzel, it was a powerful affirmation that one small act of kindness could indeed change the world. Together, they had built something that would last, a legacy of hope, compassion, and unwavering belief in the human spirit. As the evening of the fundraiser came to a close, Denzel and John stood outside the venue, the city's lights casting a warm glow over their faces. The energy of the event lingered in the air, a quiet hum of accomplishment and possibility. John looked out at the bustling streets, his hands resting in his pockets, his posture no longer hunched. He felt different, not just because of the applause or the success of the event, but because for the first time in years, he could see a future that wasn't defined by struggle. "You know," John said, his voice soft, "if you told me a year ago I'd be standing here, I wouldn't have believed you. Hell, I'd have laughed in your face." Denzel chuckled, leaning against the railing beside him. "I don't blame you. A lot's changed since then." John nodded, his gaze distant as he reflected. "It's not just me, though. It's everyone we're reaching. It's all those people who needed someone to say, 'I see you.' That's what tonight was about. And it feels good. Really good." Denzel smiled, watching the transformation in John's expression. There was no trace of the man who had sat on a curb with a sign that first night. Instead, there stood a man filled with purpose and hope, a man who had reclaimed his identity. "What's next for you?" Denzel asked after a moment, curious to hear John's thoughts now that the event had wrapped up. John glanced at him, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "I've been thinking about that. I want to keep working with the housing center, helping other guys like me find their footing. And well," he hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. "I've been saving up. There's this little shop downtown, a repair place. It's for sale. I was thinking maybe, just maybe, I could turn it into something." Denzel's grin widened. That's the John the first know. Taking back control, building something for yourself. "You should go for it." John exhaled, his grin faltering for a moment. "It's scary, though. I mean, what if I fail? What if I—" "John," Denzel interrupted, his tone firm but kind. "You've already done the hardest part. You've stood back up. You faced everything life threw at you and kept moving. Starting a business? That's nothing compared to what you've already overcome." John let the words sink in, nodding slowly. Yeah, maybe you're right. I know I'm right," Denzel said with a playful nudge. "And when you open that shop, you better believe I'll be your first customer." They laughed together, the moment light but filled with meaning. It was a simple conversation, yet it marked a turning point for John. He could feel the weight of his past lifting, replaced by a cautious optimism for what lay ahead. In the weeks that followed, the momentum from the fundraiser continued to grow. Donations poured in, enabling the campaign to expand its reach. New housing centers were opened, job training programs were launched, and mental health support services were scaled up across the country. The stories of veterans like John became a rallying cry for change, shifting public perceptions and inspiring legislative action to improve support for veterans. John stayed deeply involved in the movement, balancing his time between volunteering at the housing center and planning the purchase of his repair shop. True to his word, Denzel remained by his side, offering advice and encouragement whenever doubts crept in. Finally, one crisp autumn morning, the shop was officially his. The sign above the door read John's Fix-It Shop, a simple name for a place filled with dreams. On opening day, Denzel showed up with a big grin and a broken lamp. "You said I'd be your first customer," Denzel joked, handing over the lamp. John laughed, shaking his head as he took the lamp. "All right, let's see what I can do." The shop became more than just a business. It became a hub for the community. Veterans stopped by, drawn by John's story and his willingness to help others. He hired a few of them, offering jobs to those looking for a fresh start just as he had once needed. Years later, at a quiet reunion dinner, Denzel and John sat together, reflecting on everything that had happened. The hero's unforgotten campaign had become a national movement, touching countless lives. But for Denzel, the real success lay in moments like this, seeing John not just surviving, but thriving. "You know," John said, raising a glass of iced tea, "none of this would have happened if you hadn't stopped that night." Denzel smiled, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but you're the one who did the hard work, John. All I did was give you a nudge. The rest? That was all you." They clinked their glasses together, their laughter echoing in the room. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. For both men, it was a testament to the power of kindness, resilience, and the belief that even the smallest acts could spark profound change. And as they sat there, two friends who had once been strangers on a city street, the future felt brighter than ever.